Hello, everyone. Happy Saturday. Hope you're all doing well. So today, without further ado, we're getting into VG Matthews' video on Elden Ring and the bosses, the problems with the bosses. So that'll be a fun thing to tackle. Little FYI, just in case you catch this on the re-upload, this is going to be the last Elden Ring video I plan to react to. So sorry. I'm tired of reacting to Elden Ring stuff. I want to do other things. So here we are. And I don't really have any preamble to this. This video's about 2 hours long. I don't know if we'll get through it in a single stream or not. I have titled this Part 1. Hopefully we can get through it in good time. But we'll see what VG Matthew has to say about Elden Ring's bosses and the problems he's encountered with them. So we'll see what he's talking about. We'll see how he's doing, what he's thinking, what's in his brain, what's sludging around in his innards. And we'll see how far we get. I have a plan to try to get this done by the end of the year, whether we do it in 2 parts or 3 parts. So kind of depending on how that works out, this might be the last, maybe the last thing we cover for 2024. If not, then the last ESAS of 2024 will be a Sekiro video. So we'll see how it goes. And yeah, no other preamble. Let's just get right into it.
A couple months ago, I released a general critique of Elden Ring where I detailed some problems that I had with the game. I think the most important takeaway from that video was how the overtuned and overly aggressive boss fights were often at odds with the quote-unquote hard but fair ideology that defined the Souls games Bloodborne and Sekiro. The more I've played Elden Ring, the more I've started to feel that its greatest flaw is that it tries too hard to surpass its predecessors, and these boss fights are the biggest symptom of that mindset. The best way I can describe them is over-engineered. So much bloat has been attached in what feels like an attempt to uphold the FromSoft reputation of being mind-numbingly difficult, which has ironically strayed them as far as they've ever gone from the series' original appeal. It pains me a little bit to say this, but Elden Ring has left me with a nagging sense that the series' combat is showing signs of stagnation. In this video,
And this is one thing, that opening minute is spot on to how I feel about the bosses as well. Just I've used like different wording, but that's basically how I feel. You know, they've overclocked the bosses. They're getting away from hard but fair, and the combat is showing, is like he said, showing signs of stagnation. Like we're reaching a brick wall, is what I've said. We've reached the brick wall in terms of what they can do with this combat without fundamentally changing it. And I largely agree. And this is one thing. If I agree with a lot of stuff he says, I'll probably just stop it and point out I agree with that and then move on because I don't really have anything to add. Like, and this is one thing. This is the first minute of content I've ever seen from him, and so far, just bang up job, my dude. I agree wholeheartedly. I think your footage is a little strange because it seems like footage from a newbie player, based on some of the decisions making during the boss fights, but that's sort of besides the point. But yeah, so far I am in full agreement.
be detailing all of my praises and all of my problems with the game's boss design by looking at the major fights on a case-by-case basis. The overall goal is to examine what makes boss fights succeed and fail in these games, and talk about what kind of lessons can be taken away from Elden Ring, because I worry that the game's monstrous success will propel future titles in a similar direction. There's just a couple housekeeping items to go over before jumping into it. First off, this game has over 100 bosses with lots of different ways you can classify them, so I've deliberated quite a bit over what constitutes a major boss. There is no clear one-size-fits-all criteria. Just doing Remembrance bosses is a decent start, but that would exclude lots of important fights like Margit and Loretta. Conversely, talking about all 100-something bosses would be excessive, plus there's a lot of duplicate bosses which needs to be somehow considered. I would like to avoid getting bogged down in every single enemy with a boss health bar, so here's what we'll go with. If the boss gives you a remembrance when you kill it, it's included in this video. In addition to that, I've picked out a handful of extra ones that have some relatively large significance, whether it's through the story, gating progression to an area, or in their moveset complexity. Basically, I've tried to pick things that would actually be interesting to talk about. This is the final list that I've settled on. It probably
All right. I was going to bring this up at some point, but since he threw a list, I do want to go through it. All right, Margaret, Godric, Renala. All right, Magma Worm, Star Scourge Dawn. See why he's going over the Valiant Gargoyles. I'm not. This is one thing is I'm assuming the ones that are sort of big repeated enemies. I'm assuming he's going to bring up multiple times. So I don't know if he's talking about a specific magma worm, but there are several magma worms in the game. So we'll see how if he covers all of them or if he's covering a specific one. I'm pretty sure the Valiant Gargoyles he's talking about are the dual gargoyles you fight in that one boss arena, because I don't think there's any other proper boss version with a health bar as opposed to those two. So we got Estelle, let's see, Fortisax, Rykard, Morgott, Commander Nile. This is one thing. He put Commander Nile on here, but not the other commander. Maybe he's going to lump the two of them together just because they're somewhat similar. They're not the same, but they're somewhat similar. Let's see, Moog. This is one thing I'm wondering about too is let's see, he's got Margit on here, but he has Margit on here and Morgott, but he only has Moog on here, like the big Moog it looks like. So I'm curious why he's doing the duel for Margit and them and not the duel for Moog. But there's probably a reason for that, since Margit's largely going to be the first sort of real boss that the first sort of main boss that people will deal with. All right, Fire Giant, Loretta. I don't know which Loretta. Probably the main one. Melania, Placidusax, Malekith, Godfrey, and then the duo at the end. So it looks like a pretty good list of the big ones. I feel like some of the minor ones, like the Magma Worm, the Valiant Gargoyles, Commander Nile, and Loretta, I think are going to be interesting to talk about just because they're not hugely rewarding bosses, but they do pop up in sort of different ways throughout the game. So I'm curious of what he'll say about each of them as we get to them. So we'll see how he does when he gets through this list.
probably isn't perfect, but for the purpose of studying the game's overall boss design philosophy, I think it's perfectly adequate. I should also mention that I've done all of these fights except for one of them without summons of any kind. While I'll always advocate that it's perfectly valid to use the tools that you have the most fun with, I really dislike the effect that summons have on the game, so I won't be using them. There's a chapter near the end of my Elden Ring critique that addresses this in further detail, but the gist of it is they turn the tides in your favor too drastically by breaking the aggro on many bosses. They're strong enough that they would render many talking points completely irrelevant, and it wouldn't make for a very interesting discussion if I brute forced every single fight with a Mimic tier. I'd also like to quickly mention that I've gone through Elden Ring 4 times with very different builds each time. First a Dex Arcane Bleed build, then a Strength Faith Melee Magic hybrid, then Pure Magic, then Pure Strength. The wealth of options that Elden Ring provides means that two people could have extremely different experiences against the same bosses, so I've done my best to cast a wide net and look at these fights with different approaches. That should be everything, so with all that said, thank you for joining me. Let's talk about Elden Ring's bosses, starting with Margit.
Foul tarnished.
Generally speaking, the more I've fought bosses throughout the Soulsborne series, the more things I've found to love about them. Unfortunately, the opposite has happened many times with Elden Ring, including Margit, who's fallen from one of my favorite bosses to being just decent. Before getting into his actual moveset though, I think it's important to acknowledge Margit's placement in the game. He's somewhat analogous to the Asylum Demon or Eudex Gundyr, the tutorial boss that you need to beat to prove that you have the aptitude for the game. The key difference is that Margit doesn't block progression. Technically, he's an optional boss. It's just very unlikely that new players will skip him given that he's situated fairly early on in Limgrave. Difficulty is difficult to quantify, but I think it's fair to say that Margit is a considerable step up from many early bosses that the series has seen before now, making
I'd agree with that. I think a lot of Margit's sort of difficulty comes by showing what the game has in store, and some people can have issues with that. But given how he's got a very heavy combo system, he's got basically unavoidable poise knockback on certain moves. It's one of those fights that I think shows different aspects of the combat that you're going to deal with moving forward, but it inherently also shows the problems that you're going to be dealing with moving forward.
Making an early boss such a massive roadblock would be counterproductive in many games simply because it's an easy way to turn away new players, but it works greatly in Elden Ring's favor. It's a teaching moment that takes nice advantage of the new open world format. There's hours of content that you can tackle before Margit, and if you do that first, you'll come back to him with better levels and gear. He'll be a lot more reasonable that way. I think he communicates this intention very well, and while FromSoft has never really shied away from bold choices like this one, they still deserve some amount of praise for recognizing that it was the right thing to do. There's more to Margit than just the fight itself. It's a clever way to demonstrate that you aren't really required to do anything in any particular order. It's encouraging you to interact with other components of the game. Regarding his actual mechanics, he's a decently strong start, but he marks the beginning of many problematic trends that are found across bosses for the rest of the game. For example, he has an abundance of delayed attacks with very long windups leading into an instant spring of a hitbox, moves that you can only dodge by learning their strict timing instead of reacting naturally to an incoming attack. Now, these sorts of things are more forgivable with Margit since he comes so early in the game when you are still being taught all of the lessons. Delayed attacks have a lot of advantages, like punishing panic rolling and diverting from purely reactive play, which are good lessons to reinforce with the first boss. It makes sense that Margit is here to foster that mindset early, but the game relies on delayed attacks far too much to uphold its difficulty, which will be a very consistent complaint throughout this video. Something else about Margit that I've only realized after fighting him so much is that positioning is often just as important for avoiding his attacks as rolling. Sticking close to him for most of the fight isn't really safe, since some of his moves attack faster than you can roll, and you need to make sure you're a safe enough distance to dodge away from them should they come out. His 3-hit combo is a good example of this. I've never been able to roll through it without getting hit at least once. The timing is either extremely tight or downright impossible. The second or third hit always catches the tail end of your roll animation before you can act again. This would be fine if the telegraph gave you enough time to position yourself properly before his hitbox came out, but the first sword swing of this combo comes out so quickly that unless you're already a safe distance away, there's not much you can do.
I mean, that's a point I'd agree with very well. Is the positioning on Margit does make the fight a lot harder, and it's one of those things that I think I don't know if he'll bring up this point later on, but it is one of those things where I feel like a lot of the bosses incentivize the player to basically run away from the boss during certain moves, which isn't inherently a bad thing in isolation. But when so many moves and combos force the player to retreat, or give the player a really strong inclination that it's best to retreat rather than try to dodge through combos, I think you end up creating an encounter that becomes more tedious as you go through. Because while dodging is about negating damage, should that be extended by having the player run away from the boss? Especially when you have bosses that have high health pools, right? Particularly at certain points in the game. It's like mixing in, the combos like this that act so fast that they're hard to dodge unless you're in a very particular spot does lead to issues with, you know, it leads to issues with how much time are you going to spend running away from the boss and dodging them compared to when you get your hit in, and that's one thing that this game I think does very poorly is maintain that sort of dance that a lot of previous Souls games had with their bosses. And it's that problem where, as the series goes on, the openings for the player to attack or to counter The distance between each opportunity to strike has gotten wider and wider and wider as the series has gone on average, right? Like some bosses are better than others, right? But it is a problem where the combos being so fast to the point that rolling is a bad idea means that you instinctively need to know when a certain attack is coming, when the animation for that attack is far too fast to have your player realistically dodge away from the attack in question, right? It's also a thing where a lot of dodges no longer work in general, right? You need a very specific type of dodge, right? Melania's waterfowl dance is a good example of that, right? If her waterfowl starts, you have to dodge in a very particular direction to your right and to her left, right? But then you have to also, dodge a very particular way on each subsequent sort of burst of the combo, right? And that's part of the problem with dodging combos like that is there are so many ways that it can catch you out that it ends up funneling you into the same sort of strategy over and over and over again. You've essentially, created systems and combos and attacks in general that lead players to it leads players to finding one efficient method that works and never straying from it, because every time you do stray from it you get punished, and oftentimes it feels like you're getting punished unfairly. Is that objectively true all the time? Not necessarily, but there is a significant problem with dodging certain attacks in this game, because when you find one way that works consistently, you're best to stick with that, because a lot of the options that you would typically have in previous From Software games to deal with these attacks are not going to work, because they've designed these things to catch players out based on what they've seen players do in their previous games. It's that ever evolving issue of, instead of evolving the content or developing the content and making it more multidimensional, they just add things that catch out what players will naturally do anyway. So instead of giving us a lot of different new ways to deal with things, we instead have delayed attacks. We instead have giant AoEs. Instead, we have things that would be typical problems in other games, but now they're delayed, or the combos are so fast we don't have time to dodge through all of them, right? It's that thing where you're not expanding on the mechanics so much as making the process more tedious, or you're making the process unfair to the point where there's only one real solution to deal with the problem, right? And that ends up making the fights very sort of one dimensional when the solution is very one note whenever it comes up, right? And it is one of those things where different builds and different things can do different things to deal with bosses, but largely there are certain moves that are just best dealt with in a very, very particular way. Otherwise, you're going to have issues, right? It's not like a lot of the other bosses where you can dodge in different directions, and have things work differently. And this is part of the problem with trying to make the bosses more complicated, is that by making the bosses more complicated, you've unintentionally made dealing with them more simplified in what you actually mechanically do to deal with the problems, right? This is where the older games kind of have a leg up in a way, because if a boss does a 3 swipe combo that goes like, I don't know, like diagonally down to the left, diagonally down to the right, and then a straight thrust, right? You can dodge those in different ways in the old games, right? Like you can dodge all those differently if the rhythm is appropriately like managed, right? But with the combos that you see with Margit, you get that quick slash in the middle that'll catch you out, or you get, a very delayed attack like just after the combo should have ended when it's not actually over, right? So you get this weird sort of disjointed rhythm of combat to this game with its bosses compared to the previous ones. Now, I'm not saying that every boss needs to have a consistent like beats per minute or beats per combo type of thing to make the combat flow well. But when you make bosses very jerky and very delayed, it makes the entire experience feel uneven, right? As opposed to having a boss that has some sort of consistency with the flow of their attacks, right? Or the sort of flow at which the overall combat goes between you hitting the boss and the boss hitting you.
It's one of many moves in the game that doesn't give you adequate time to adjust your positioning, especially considering that he can do it just after you've punished one of his moves. This isn't helped by the fact that lots of his recovery windows aren't very clear. At the end of many combos, he makes it look like he's done attacking, but as soon as you get close, he'll pull out his knife and start another chain. It's a bit deceptive, which I don't really mind in theory, but it
Here's one thing. I want
narrows
to
your
I
start
want to
another
go.
chain.
I want to go
Look
back.
like he's done attacking, but as soon as you get close, he'll pull out his knife and start another chain.
Yeah, I think I see where he's coming from there because it's like the difference I would say is
Makes it look like he's done attacking, but as soon as you get close, he'll pull out his
yeah. See, like the only difference in the way this combo like shifts is that the animation of his hands starts glowing like a frame or two before his combo actually ends up coming, right? So like if you have the pinpoint accurate knowledge of the attack is coming whenever this hand comes down faster than normal, then it's coming, right? Which is part of the problem with the combos is, this is another problem with combos in general. It's just when you create combos that have sort of additional things that can randomly be added, you have the player backing off during a window when they should be able to attack because they don't actually know if the combo is going to continue or not. And that can lead to issues of, do I actually know if this combo's over or should I just wait and see? Which, in my opinion, just delays the fight because instead of taking an opening that looks obvious or it looks real, you're sitting back because you know that the boss has a cheap extension of the combo that'll just tap you when you think you're open. You know, and it's similar to the way a lot of the auto dodging of the auto dodging of bosses. I don't know why that took forever to get out. And the auto punishment for healing is a significant problem, is because you feel like you're in the clear, and then as soon as you do something, the boss reacts to it faster than you can counter react to it. And it's that kind of problem where where are the openings in a lot of encounters have become much more blurred in this game as opposed to the previous ones. There's a lot of animations that get a extension, oftentimes based on what the player is doing. Like if the player is trying to drink a flask when they think a combo's over, the boss will usually extend the combo in some way, right? And it's one of those weird AI things where I don't know how they make the AI judge that, but the game is clearly built to punish you for doing very specific things at very specific moments. We see that with all of the input reading isn't the technical term. People have had a debate about that, but it's basically the same thing where the boss is reacting to your move from the first frame that you do it. And often those punishes don't have nearly enough room in them for you to counteract it. And so that becomes a problem along with the combos extensions and dodging like spells and stuff, like all the stuff that just automatically happens for bosses becomes a problem when it comes to mitigating the difficulty in a way that seems fair. you know it's similar to as soon as you hit heal, a boss just immediately goes into a quick thrust that has half of the animation frames as your healing animation does, right? It's clearly built to catch you out, right? It's clearly built to screw you when you think you're open, and that kind of stuff makes all the bosses feel much more deceptive, which means you're going to take longer in between doing stuff with bosses because you're not quite sure if this is an opening or not. Which, yeah, it makes the boss harder, but it also makes it more tedious to fight because you're taking longer because you aren't sure of your openings. Hi, Shan. Hope you're doing well.
his knife and start another chain. It's a bit deceptive, which I don't really mind in theory, but it narrows your opportunities to engage with him and funnels players into being a lot more defensive. I never started picking up on this behavior until I got more comfortable with the fight, since it felt like my options for approaching him never changed with my skill level. You still have to engage with him the same way you did on your first few attempts, by playing very passively and only waiting for the handful of openings that you know are safe. All of your decisions are the same. You can just traverse through the flowchart of options faster while making fewer mistakes, and such a noticeable skill cap makes him a lot less exciting to return to. His greatest weakness is probably the issue of his ambiguous recovery windows. Either the animation would need to better communicate when he is and isn't done attacking, or the constant knife sidearm moves need to be toned down. It's very obnoxious having a boss only follow up as soon as you get close, because it feels like you're being disallowed from playing. The only reason I don't think Margit is downright bad is because these problems have a comparatively smaller magnitude. Most of his moveset feels pretty good otherwise, with a difficulty that's well adjusted for his place in the game. The highest compliment that I can give Margit is that he leaves a very strong first impression. It's just that those feelings have dwindled a lot over time. It is equally upsetting that even though he's just decent overall, he still remains one of the better bosses when put against Elden Ring's remaining lineup.
All right, we're about to transition here, so check out chat. I'm doing okay. Semester exams are finally over. Did you see Fortnite Elden Ring announcement? So wait, so did Fortnite do a thing with Elden Ring, or are we talking about the night thing, Night Vein, or whatever the Elden Ring announcement was? Because I just watched that trailer before getting on the stream, and all I could think of was I don't care. I wish I had that clip of Harrison Ford going, I don't care, because I really just don't care. Also, how are you doing? I'm doing good. I'm enjoying the holidays. Yeah, the new game. Yeah, that's the thing. The trailer, I couldn't tell if that was like a new game or not, or if it was a DLC for Elden Ring, or if it like what the hell. I couldn't tell what the hell it was. You know, I actually could not tell what it was. Also, I'm glad that you're done with your exams. I've got relatives in school, and it's like, oh, okay, you know, I hope everyone passes that deserves it. But yeah, I saw the announcement. I feel nothing at this point for any Elden Ring content. It's kind of dead inside to me. All right, so now we're getting into Godric, right? Yeah, here we go. Tarnished.
Godric fares considerably better than Margit, and he's one of my favorite fights. The boss quality reaches a pretty high peak this early on with Godric, and takes a very shaky trajectory after him. Honestly, I don't think it reflects very well on Elden Ring that two of the better bosses are strategically placed right at the beginning, as if to hide the troubles that the rest of the game faces, but that's kind of a separate discussion.
This is one thing that I haven't really considered actually is I find Godric to be really easy upon replaying the game several times over, and I never actually realized that that's because most of his moveset is very fair. And I feel like that's the thing that kind of skipped over me whenever I fight him is like, I never actually realized how fair most of his moveset is upon actually thinking about it and having Matthew pointed out, it was like, yeah, it is kind of weird how of all the bosses that are sort of like the rune ones that give you like the special remembrances and stuff, upon thinking about it for a minute, Godric actually is really fair by comparison to the other ones. Like he doesn't have a particularly egregious bullshit move like a lot of the other ones do. Like Renala summons like a bunch of summons in like the second half of her phase 2, which is really annoying. Radon just hits ridiculously hard. See, Morgoth's got really, 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 really extended combos and stuff. Rykard's gimmick is just annoying as hell. The deer just run away from you half the fight, which is annoying. Melania has her issues with the health restoration and waterfowl being overpowered. Fire giants, tedious, deals way too much fire damage. No, the more I think about it, the more it's like, yeah, Godric actually is pretty damn fair compared to every other like major boss in the game. And I didn't really think about that as much until just now when it's like, yeah, by comparison to all the other bosses that are like major ones, he is probably the most fair one. They basically used many old assets and created a new game. It looked like it. I mean, I saw a direct nameless king in there. Like it seems like what was that game by Blizzard? Heroes of the Storm, I think it was, where it's basically just, or maybe like Kingdom Hearts is a better example, where they just took assets from other stuff and just threw it in a game. It looked like that. Now, granted, I'm disinterested in general, but it looks like that. And seeing people like cumming their pants in the comment section of that video just made me go, "Oh, you sweet, sweet. Oh, I hope you have fun with it, because I'm not. I'm not going to pick it up." It is a co-op multiplayer thing, so probably very different experience. Probably. I can't help but love Morgoth fight though. It is so cinematic. Lol. I think Morgoth's got the more interesting sort of like dynamics to him in terms of like how it thematically works and how it sort of like how he's talking to you throughout the entire fight. He's got a lot of different elements outside of just the actual fight itself that I think adds to it. But it is one of those things where it's like I still have problems with the fight. Yeah, it's just I don't know. Anyway, getting back to Godric here.
Anyway, one thing they definitely got right with Godric from a thematic standpoint is portraying him as one of the more pitiful demigods. Despite how intimidating he might look initially, many other characters don't speak very highly of him, not necessarily because he's weak, but rather he's pathetic. He tries to replicate the power of other demigods artificially by grafting all his body parts together, and beneath all of those limbs is a character deservedly stuck in the shadow of his lineage. I don't normally comment on lore details, but I think many people's perception of Godric has changed a lot over time, and it makes for a pretty interesting character, so I thought it was worth mentioning. The main reason that he's one of the strongest bosses in the game is because, unlike many others, there's not tons of bloat weighing him down. He has a nice combination of melee attacks, AoEs, mobility tricks, and so on. There's no absurdly long combos, no unexpected gimmicks, and his downtime between attacks is very reasonable. They knew when enough was enough with Godric, and the moves that he does have were given the care and balance that they needed, for the most part. Once again, though, he relies on delayed attacks a bit too much for my liking, particularly with one of his basic axe swings. The common problem with these moves is that they'll be delayed to a degree where it just looks unnatural. The reality with many games is that our brains have a tendency to apply real-life logic to whatever's happening on screen, which is partially what determines our following actions. When you see an enemy raise their weapon, your natural response in both real life and in Elden Ring is to do something as soon as it's at the apex. Games that manage to tap into those instincts and let us operate purely on intuition without having to worry about the game's rules tend to feel the most natural to play. Lots of people would describe this as immersive, or entering into that precious flow state. Delayed attacks will force the player to go against those impulses, which isn't automatically a bad thing. In fact, it can create a lot of value if it's used properly. For the purposes of creating a difficult game, I'd say it's almost necessary at certain points, since, like I mentioned with Margit, it can punish bad habits and generate different responses from the player. But when this trick is used as excessively as it is in Elden Ring, you go too far with that idea and constantly punish the player for acting on instinct.
Yeah, that's one thing that he makes a good point on is, like whenever you create mechanics in games that are built off of sort of intuitive thinking, you eventually run into an issue where you try to create things that are counterintuitive, right? And that leads to issues where, how can I predict something is going to be counterintuitive when it's counterintuitive, right? It's that issue where you're creating an encounter, no matter what it is, where you're actively telling the player to fight against their own sort of instincts and logic. And that leads to issues in games, especially games like this, where difficulty is so paramount based on giving the player openings to deal with things, right? And it's one of those problems that I think this game suffers from the most out of From's catalog as of late. It's just making player. It's a thing where in the fight, the boss. Why would the boss delay an attack? Like in a typical sword fight, why would someone delay an attack, right? Or in a typical like just any typical fight, why would you hold your punch back and give the person time enough to react to it whenever you actually decide to swing, right? It's one of those like it's anti logic, right? Just to make the game harder, just to make the combos more deadly because they will catch you out because you're used to rolling when the weapon, raises up, not when it, immediately is coming down over the course of like, a fifth of a second, right? Like all these things are pushing players out of that sort of intuitive nature and towards kind of counter logic, and it no longer becomes intuitive based on what you see. It's intuitive based on what you know, which is stuff that, makes the fights feel a lot more unfair because you're sitting here thinking, you know, on your first time, it's like, oh, the weapon has gone up. I bet it's going to come down in a second. But then when the boss holds it up there forever, you're like, why are you just dancing around with your sword in the air or your axe in the air? Like, attack me, damn it. Like, why are you doing this? And it's one of those things that I think takes several players out of the game. Not everybody, but I think it does take several players out of the experience where it's like, okay, this is just a reminder that it's making me, that I'm fighting a boss that knows how players act. So it's directly trying to counter things that I would naturally do. And I think that now shaking things up isn't a bad idea, but I do think that this over reliance on sort of counterintuitive sort of boss philosophy is biting From in the ass, because while the game is selling really well, the game is receiving a lot of criticism for its bosses, right? I've seen a lot of views going to a lot of videos about criticisms of the bosses, particularly the ones near the end game, which should be where the fruits of your labor come to fruition, right? Because they're end game bosses. These should be the absolute peak of experiencing the content. They should not be the biggest problems you have in the game.
Whenever one of these delayed attacks comes up, you have to remind yourself that the boss isn't behaving how a normal entity would, and the flow state is at least somewhat broken as a result. The axe swing that I mentioned earlier is Godrick's best example of this, but his mini earthquake, his jump attack, and his more powerful wide arc swing also do it to varying degrees. The only one that I'd say ventures into overly frustrating territory is that axe swing, but these things can only remain tolerable for so long. You need only to look at his 5-hit combo for an example of something that feels much more natural. The swings come out when you'd expect, and it's fun to weave through them while still being difficult to fully avoid. He gains a few additional attacks in Phase 2, but otherwise the fight is pretty similar. I still greatly enjoy the second phase, partially because of the cutscene that initiates it, which is both incredibly cool and incredibly fitting for his whole pathetic demigod portrayal. I really like phase changes that come out of left field like this. Obviously, it makes sense for Godrick's character to staple on stronger limbs like he does, but I wasn't anticipating getting to see that change directly. It's up there as one of my favorite phase transitions in the series. Another advantage of Godrick that shines throughout the fight is having very clear attack telegraphs. This is somewhat in contrast to Margit, who didn't always make it clear when his attacks were finished. Godrick is very much the opposite, and it makes for a much more enjoyable battle. Not only is there adequate time to identify his attacks as they're about to come out, it's also always clear when it's safe for you to retaliate. This is part of what makes him feel like a more natural fight. It never feels like you get unfairly punished for correctly identifying his behavior. The numerous dragon attacks he gains are a great example of this. His new arm sort of exhibits behavior of its own with moves like the grab, and all of it is very satisfying to read and dodge. Unfortunately, there is one element of Godrick that throws a pretty big wrench into all of this. It's a very major issue that I'm surprised hasn't been addressed in patches yet. His whirlwind attack has an extremely short startup and he can pull it out whenever he wants. To compare him to Margit again, it's kind of like the 3-hit combo that I was complaining about, only I think Godrick is worse. If you walk in to punish one of his moves, there's a chance he'll do the whirlwind before you have a chance to reposition safely. It also comes out too fast to reasonably react to, which just crosses the line into blatant unfairness.
That's one thing I would agree on, is like his whirlwind thing is one of those moves that unless you're in a very particular position and you get really lucky, you're going to have a hard time negating damage from that if you're dodging. Also considering that he does pull it out really fast.
Attacks like these are part of why I don't think it's a reasonable defense to say that positioning is the solution to Elden Ring's boss problems, because you aren't even left with enough time to do that. I think you would be justified in saying that this move alone is enough to bring Godrick standing down, even though almost everything else about him is great. If it did more damage, I would probably feel that way too. It's a really bad move that would benefit greatly from a slower startup. If you did that, plus made a couple of his attacks less delayed, Godrick would pretty easily be my favorite boss, and up there as one of the stronger fights in the whole series. As it stands now, he's one of the best in Elden Ring, which, while great, is generally at a lower standard than its peers. Either way, I do really like Godric. It's just a big disappointment that things don't get a whole lot better from here.
Now we're Lana.
Little Culver.
Renala has a whole lot of style, but with very little substance. Her two phases try to combine a gimmick boss and a normal boss into a single fight, but I think it would have gone over much better if they committed to one of those styles because the two phases sort of clash with each other in their current state. Phase 1 is the gimmick fight. It's a puzzle where she's invulnerable until you break her shield by attacking certain enemies in the arena. It's not difficult, and there's very few attacks coming at you, but I think that's fine. The atmosphere makes it worthwhile. The music lends quite a bit to the scene, and I think the Grand Library environment fits very well with Raya Lucaria's Magic Academy theme. The entire dungeon is more occult than Stormveil, and the boss has a mysterious tone to match that. I also think using sound to identify where the shielded enemies are is kind of cool. It took me a while to realize this, but the singing always originates from the enemy you're supposed to attack. Once you figure that out, it's a lot easier to blitz through Phase 1. The main problem with gimmicks like these is that they only have an emotional impact the first time you see them. If you die, any subsequent attempts lose their luster, since the experience had to be interrupted. I won't spoil what it is here, but Sekiro addressed this issue with one of its gimmick fights by making it so easy and simple to understand that you can win on your first try, even without any prior knowledge of the boss. It dropped the pretense of being anything other than a spectacle fight, and it's very successful as a result. This is where Phase 2 of Renala comes in. It still isn't hard, but it is an actual fight where you're more likely to die a couple times learning how everything works. If that happens, the Phase 1 gimmick becomes a chore that you have to put up with every time you want to reattempt the actual fight. The first attack is another delayed move with heavy damage and unusual timing, and that alone can catch players off guard right away. I would have preferred to see the second phase given the complete spotlight. It's pretty easy once you realize you can just stick close and wail on her, while only needing to sprint around every now and then to dodge most of her magic. The way you respond to everything isn't very involved, since you can get away with just running in circles. She's also faced with the issue of most of her attacks being ranged, which means her AI has to move far away from you to stand a chance. Since avoiding her attacks is pretty monotonous, there can be quite a bit of empty time where no side is making progress towards victory. It's kind of like Elden Beast's behavior, just on a smaller scale.
That's a good point. It's like when the and this again feeds into a problem with a lot of the bosses is bosses running away from you waste so much of your time. And I bet that if you actually do break down the boss fights in terms of how much time they spend running away from you and you chasing after them versus actually attacking and trading, I bet there's a significant percentage of the combat that is just chasing after the boss. Right? A lot of bosses have that issue. You know, I mean, just downtime in between dodging attacks. I bet there's a sizable portion of the fight that is exactly that, where you're either running after the boss because they're far away from you, or the boss is already attacking you, but they're doing it from range after getting out of reach, so to speak. Malekith is probably the best example of this, as he is jumping around and spinning up in the air, and most builds are just going to have a hard time dealing with him when he's doing that because he's spinning around in the air. Like most range builds aren't going to be able to hit him because it takes too long to shoot anything, and most projectiles don't travel fast enough to hit him while he's up there. And several other bosses have problems with that too. It's one of those letdowns where it's like they could have done something interesting with this stuff, but a lot of it just boils back to just overclock the bosses, make them as difficult and as long-winded as possible.
This is really just my long-winded way to say Phase 2 is boring, even though the arena remains visually strong. I also dislike how easy it is to get stun-locked against some of her attacks. If you get clipped by a single piece of magic, it can very quickly snowball into a bunch of stacked shots that deal a massive chunk of health if they don't kill you entirely. If something like this happens on your first couple encounters with Phase 2, they don't feel like fair deaths. It can become an overly harsh punishment for what was probably a pretty minor mistake on your part. Stun locks aren't exclusive to her at all, but she was the first instance where it got under my skin. Her most notable ability is the summoning of other enemies during the fight, which is yet another disappointment. I'm not sure if it had the effect that they were going for. They don't stick around very long, and it's easy to ignore them while continuing to focus on Renala. Trying to kill them is more effort than it's worth because you still have to deal with her magic attacks on top of that enemy's normal moveset. It's not like she's summoning unique enemies that are built to work in tandem with her magic. They're just the same wolves or knights found all over the world that have little bearing on how you fight the boss. The one final dig I want to take at her is that she's tied for the worst run back in the game. Now that we have Stakes of America, it's very odd to me that this is still a problem, especially in a boss fight that's already very tedious. If you use the shortcut and send the elevator back down each time, it takes about 1 minute to run to her from the nearest Grace. That may not sound like much initially, but it adds up when combined with repeating the same Phase 1 puzzle every attempt on top of it. I know the lore justification for this is because Renala probably hates Marika, so why would she want her stakes in the Academy? But I disagree heavily with letting such a mild story detail make gameplay more cumbersome.
That's one thing that I would agree on. This is one thing that I think in general is unless there's a Grace directly in front of the boss wall, I think a Stake of America is reasonable. Right? I think it's very reasonable. You know, and it's one of those things where different bosses have different things for some reason, which I don't quite understand. You know, like it's one of those things where like Melania has a Grace right in front of her boss door, right? Same thing with Godric. All right, those make sense. Rykard has one directly in front of him. That makes sense. You know, Renala has a pretty decent run back, you know, because you actually have to go through enemies again, even with a shortcut. Right? There's no Stake America, nothing. You actually have to run back and deal with enemies, right? In one way or another, whether you fight them or whether you run past them, right? When you look at like a lot of the other bosses, they don't have that, right? Just kind of going off of the main sort of sort of the main bosses that you deal with, right, in the game, right? Margit, Grace is right in front of the door. Godric, Grace is right in front of the door. The first red wolf you encounter, you have to fight through enemies. You have to fight through enemies to reach him again. Renala, you have to fight through enemies to reach her again. Or you have to get past enemies to reach her again. I guess I should say like that. All right, so then you have Radon, right? There's a Stake of America right before the portal, right? So that essentially functions as an easy reset. Then you get Rykard, a Grace right in front of his door, right? Then you get Morgott, a Grace right in front of his door, right? All right, then what else am I getting? All right, then you got the two spirit deer, right? Both of them have significant runbacks because you have to spawn. I think you spawn at a Grace for one of them, and I think one of them has America. I might be wrong about that. I think both of them might have America, but either way, it's like kind of it's either generic or meh, right? Then you get to the fire giant where it's like, yeah, the boss door is right next to a Grace, but you still have to walk a little ways around, and then you still have to run up to the boss. So you may as well count that as a boss run. You know, if the boss arena is massive and you have to cross half of it to reach him, yeah, I think that should count. And then I think after him, you've got the Godskin duo, which is technically close to a Grace because there's two different ways to get in there. So one's a Grace right next to the door. Another one's a Grace that's really close, right? So that works. Malekith has you run across half the bridge, which isn't terrible, but it is one of those big gaps of just sort of nothing in between resets. The final sort of main bosses in the main line, right? There's a America statue right outside of Gideon, who spawns a Grace. And then after that, you get the Grace right before Godfrey, and then you get the Grace right before Radigan and the Elden Beast. Now, I think the Radigan Elden Beast combo is not a good combo because you essentially fight two major bosses that are locked together where you have to fight them both at the same time to win. I think that's dumb, but that's a separate issue, right? All right, when you get to Loretta, right, you get an elevator shortcut that takes you from the Grace almost directly to the boss. You have to run past like one enemy, maybe 2 if both of those mage dudes are there. Then you have Melania, which has the Grace right in front of her, right? So the majority of those bosses tend to have the Grace or the checkpoint right in front of them, whereas Renala does have a significant run back by comparison to all the others, right? Now, in comparison to run backs in most of these games, Renala's not that bad, right? There are definitely run backs that are way worse than this. But it is a thing where in a game that's littered with Marika statues and Graces right next to the boss arena, it feels like there should be one for Renala, right? Like the shortcut, and this isn't really a problem with having shortcuts or having the Marika statues. It's having both of them and then having random bosses have run backs where you actually have to deal with enemies along the way versus just Graces or Marika statues that are right next to the boss door, right? It's that weird thing where if we're going to have Marika statues and Graces next to all of these other bosses, why do very specific ones not get that, right? You know, and the area at the top of the elevator right before the boss fight with Renala, it's like there is plenty of room there to just plop a Grace down, right? You don't even have to break the lore. You can just put a Grace up there and you're good, right? Like you don't have to worry about that. Does that negate the whole point of the shortcut? I guess you could make an argument for that, but the shortcut does lead you behind where that ball trap is, right? So I think there's an argument that you can make either way for that. But it is kind of weird how Renala has an abnormally long run back by comparison to a lot of other major bosses. Actually, just most bosses in general, because most of the overworld bosses are pretty close to a Grace anyway, and most of the dungeon bosses have a stake of Marika or a statue of Marika right next to the boss door. So I think if you actually did a tally, I think Renala would have the longest run back of any boss in Elden Ring's base game. I'm not sure about the DLC. I'd have to check every single boss in the DLC, and I don't know that off the top of my head. But it is a thing where like the run back to Renala, I think, is kind of abnormally long compared to the other ones.
It's one of those things that feels more like a coincidence that we only notice after the fact. If there was one hypothetically sitting outside of her arena, would anyone actually question it? I'd argue no. I wonder how much the existence of Phase 1's gimmick hurts Phase 2's mechanics, and vice versa. I wish more focus could have been put on making her actual fight more interesting, but I would also accept the entire fight being a gimmick if they could have found ways to make a cooler puzzle. The focus on Renala's fight was spread too thin, so neither phase really got the attention they deserved. The thematic elements are definitely the saving grace on this one. I'm just glad it isn't too difficult so the player isn't stuck repeating Phase 1 for too long.
All right, he's going to move on here. One thing that I think would have been interesting to sort of maintain the gimmick but make the boss more dimensional is I think what they should have done is like keep Phase 1 the way it is. And then when Phase 2 happens, she's brought into this realm with the moon and all this stuff. But out of the water, the little like ones come out and slowly come at you, right? And then you create a dynamic where after taking like a significant portion of damage, right? Maybe 25% damage or 50% damage of her health bar. So, every 20%, every 25% something, right? Every decent chunk of health, you have one of them start glowing, right? And it creates a barrier around her, kind of like Phase 1. But during this phase, she's still attacking you, right? So you could take the gimmick and develop it in Phase 2 rather than having a totally different boss fight in Phase 2 versus Phase 1, right? And it's one of those things where I feel like the fight would have had a better flow when you do that, because having the boss fight be very gimmicky in Phase 1 and then not gimmicky hardly at all in Phase 2 makes them feel like very different fights that don't gel together, right? And it's one of those things where if you're going to do a gimmick, you may as well commit to it. This is the one thing where I think Rykard got this sort of right. Even though I don't like the gimmick of Rykard in general, I think that having the gimmick work throughout the entire boss fight is a plus for that fight. Like imagine if Rykard became Rykard in Phase 2 and we actually had to hit him, right? Or the gimmick weapon didn't work against him like a regular weapon or something, right? Like that would create separate issues. But like in general, if you're going to have a gimmick, it's good to stick with that sort of all the way through, or at least develop that idea of the gimmick, right? Like the Renala fight feels like a mixed, not a mixed bag in terms of reception, but a mixed bag in terms of they threw in phase 1 and they threw in phase 2. Like they weren't created at the same time for this boss. It felt like they had two separate ideas that were for different bosses, and then they just threw them together because make big bosses have phase change. Do it. You know, like it feels like one of those things where they just had ideas in a bag and just pulled two of them out and stuck them together to make Renala.
Light into being.
The magma worms arguably aren't prestigious enough to be on this list, but I wanted to include them solely for one reason. Their repeated fights do a good job at demonstrating the importance of the arena. The magma worms have lots of long-lasting AoEs that can restrict your mobility depending on where they're placed, and sometimes these AoEs can be spread by a charge move where the magma worm runs a pretty good distance across the arena. Basically, their attacks can cover a lot of ground, so the wiggle room that the player has to respond factors in a lot when determining the quality of these fights. Magma worms.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd say their charge move is their worst move just because it takes a long time for them to finish. They usually combo it in threes and they spray shit all over the arena. So unless you're extremely careful, you're going to probably be dealing with a long period of you not being able to do anything because they're just charging you over and over. Or you get the problem of them charging past you, and then because their entire body or 90% of their body is a hitbox, you can't melee them because you'll probably get tapped by their hitbox. Right. So it just delays fighting them because you're too busy worried about them comboing you and, you know, spewing lava. Hello, hello. Did the stream die? Okay, I'm just checking my stream here. I guess we fixed it. That's weird. Okay, that was strange. StreamYards just died on me. That was fun. All right, let's get back to this. All right, we should be good to go. I hope the stream doesn't kill itself. That was weird. Anyway, let's get back to the magma worms before StreamYards dies again.
Worm Makar is the first variant of these that I fought, and it takes place in a nice open arena where all of its attacks get a chance to shine. The AI can get confused and run into walls every now and then, but even so, this is the best instance of the magma worms since there's nothing to distract from the fight itself. The lava pools that it can spawn are a more unique addition to its moveset as a dynamic way of introducing obstacles on the field. If we look at the magma worm in Mount Gelmir, things will change. This one takes place right beside a large pool of lava, and the shape of the arena is much different. It's more like a narrow strip along this pool instead of a wide open space. As you might expect, this makes the fight a whole lot more frustrating, even though the enemy itself is more or less identical. You have much less maneuverability in the Gelmir version, since a boss that already takes up a lot of space is thrown into a more restrictive environment.
I mean, on top of that, you have the mechanical absurdity of the magma worm not being able to climb over some rocks, so it can just run into them, sort of like there's a rock face right next to the arena that is big enough where the worm can't climb over it, so it will charge you and you can just stand up there and shoot stuff at the worm. And it's like that's a terrible way to create a world boss sort of area where you can just cheese the enemies that badly. It's similar to the Tree Sentinel, right? Where you can cheese it by jumping onto like one of the wreckages that it can't like physically reach. It's just one of those things that kind of screws the entire encounter when the boss can be cheesed that easily.
This can create incredibly long stretches without any opportunities to touch the magma worm because the AI can decide to use the running attack 3 or 4 times in a row, which covers the entire place in lava and strips away possible angles that you could approach at. The magma worm enemy itself is quite good when you have the space to deal with it. Once again, it has quite a few delayed attacks, but there's also a lot of movement going on as you run away from its fireballs or position yourself in the safest spot to attack it. That strength is just stunted by only one of them having an arena that takes full advantage of the worm's potential. It goes to show how multifaceted constructing a boss can be. I appreciate wanting to add environmental hazards in certain fights, but the magma worms aren't a good execution of that idea. It takes a good boss and places it in a bad context, which definitely hurts its overall standing. If I were just discussing Magma Worm Makar, I'd say it's a very solid fight, but when looking across all of the Magma Worms, it gets a whole lot worse. For that, it averages out to being a very lukewarm boss overall.
Before we begin, allow
Here we
me
go,
to paint
the big
you
boy.
the full picture.
The major repeated asset.
Radon has a much more elaborate build-up out of all the bosses in the game. The Radon Festival is referenced by several NPCs, and he's often heralded as one of the most powerful demigods in the lore. I think the fight itself mostly satisfies the expectations set by all of this, but it's a bit tricky to judge. Radon has received several changes since the game's launch, and I'm not sure how that should factor in when appraising him. One thing that's held firm throughout the patches is his fantastic presentation. There's a scope to the Radon battle that isn't really captured by any other fight. The arena is so vast that it takes up a massive portion of Caelid's map, and Radon embodies the spirit of an insane, battle-hardened general very well. He is relentless and brutal in a way that commands your respect, and I can't think of a better way for him to go down than in the blaze of glory offered by the Radon Festival. I think I recall the main problem plaguing him upon release were his hitboxes. They were way too large and inconsistent, and his damage was incredibly high to boot. If the fight was still in that state, it would be pretty terrible, but fortunately, I think the changes they've made have been for the better, even though he still isn't perfect. Perhaps his most defining trait is the heaps of NPC summons sprinkled throughout the arena. It lends a lot more to the theme of the fight rather than the mechanics. They aren't required to win, and honestly I find it harder with so many summons since you never know who Radon is aggroed on that way. They felt more important pre-nerf when you needed tons of health sponges to stand a chance, but nowadays it's more of an optional bonus for those that want to go all in on the festival idea. I honestly don't have much to say about it. It's a fun way to fight him, but I still prefer riding solo. The other unique thing about Radon is that this is one of the few major bosses where you can use Torrent, which I'm not sure how to feel about. Many of Radon's attacks do seem to take Torrent into consideration, which is both a problem and a solution to the terribly primitive horse combat. For the most part, I hate fighting on Torrent. There's
Amen. Fuck fighting on torrent. It's terrible. I really hope that they just drop mounted combat in general. Because unless they have a major revamp of it, it is just ass.
There's barely, if any, iframes. It's so much easier to get stun locked, and attacking is a whole lot slower with timings that are just really weird to learn. It's extremely unwieldy and relegates Torrent to being mostly a traversal mechanic. Radon accounts for this by making many of his moves avoidable by just running around on your horse, which was a wise choice if they wanted to make Torrent a viable option, but it also does make things a little bit more boring. You aren't able to make quick adjustments on horseback since there's no equivalent to rolling, so the best way to dodge is just by staying on the move. You can rely on hit and run tactics pretty safely this way, and it isn't as engaging as battling on foot. I've ultimately enjoyed the fight the most by switching between the two. I try to stay up close early on when his melee combos are easier to dodge around, but as soon as it gets too hard to see what he's doing, or when I need a get out of jail free card, I'll switch to Torrent. It's not a terrible approach, and in tandem with the hitbox nerfs, it makes Radon pretty fun, but given how many different ways there are to fight him, I think whatever their intention was is communicated rather poorly. If you're meant to use all of the summons and steamroll him, then that's fine, but it would make for a pretty anticlimactic finish to the supposed mightiest demigod in the world. Alternatively, Torrent.
That's one thing I would disagree on. I think Radon's gimmick works really well given his sort of status as arguably like the most powerful demigod out there, right? And I know people would debate that as like, oh, like he and Melania fought to a standstill, blah 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 blah. But it's like he was holding back stars in the cosmos, man. Like, come on, Melania can't do that shit. All right, it's one of those things where I feel like this fight gimmick works really well because it does play on the fact that he is a fallen god essentially, and and you can have all the summons fight him and defeat him that way. I think that gimmick works really well, but it's completely optional, right? If you want to fight him directly, you can. I think that's the nice blend of gimmick and options because his fight isn't mandatory to have all the summons. Having all the summons helps with the whole Radon Festival gimmick, but you don't need to do that. If you want to fight him solo, you absolutely can. If you want to fight him in the way that the game has sort of built him up to be fought with all the summons, then you can do that too, right? It's one of those things where the gimmick and the options around the gimmick both work pretty well. Now, in terms of his move set and some of his moves, I think there are significant issues with some things here and there, but it is one of those things where I think that overall the gimmick and the fight, I think both work on their own, right? And I think committing to one or the other is better than sort of half-assing it. Sort of between the two, where you do things for a little bit and then maybe you summon when you need help, or you summon like only one or two or whatever. I think committing to either is a good way to makes the fight more engaging.
Torrent's awkward controls makes that option very unappealing, but also necessary if you want a reliable way to avoid some moves, so I'm not sure. Somewhat similar to Renala, there are some conflicting priorities here. Honestly, I think more of my problems lie with Torrent than with Radon. If Torrent wasn't as clunky as he is, Radon could have been turned into the game's signature horse battle. He's designed with Torrent's limitations in mind, and I appreciate that, but they are just that, limitations. Even if part of the fight works around them, it's hard to avoid heaps of problems that crop up with horse combat. To be a little bit more positive, Radon does have a more well-balanced moveset in terms of damage, timings, and recovery windows. Fighting him on foot is still a viable approach, at least against some moves, and he's at his peak during those moments. Even though many of his melee attacks just flail around everywhere, they are possible to dodge through with enough time to follow up afterwards. I shouldn't have to praise bosses for this, but there's also no cheap surprises for when you get up close. Nothing blatantly unavoidable like Godric's Whirlwind to deter you from being aggressive. Once you can find the confidence, clashing with Radon does make him feel worthy of that legendary status, and for a fight of such grand proportions, it's very satisfying to feel like the two of you can stand on even ground. Radon's problems being addressed in patches goes to show how Elden Ring's bosses are very fixable. It's just frustrating that, as of the making of this video, others haven't gotten the same treatment that he has. I suppose it was important to FromSoft that they got this fight right, since Radon will probably last in the memory of Elden Ring players for a while. For better or for worse, he embodies the scale and identity of the game better than most other bosses, so even though there are several slip-ups on the execution, it's difficult to ignore how memorable he is.
Oh, that comment that he made about Radon being sort of like kind of the flagship boss of the game, kind of outside Melania, of course, is like it's so weird him saying that and how that has remained true, but for even worse reasons with promised consort Radon, right? Like it's that thing where he made a really good point about Radon being like a fight that really encapsulates the best aspects of the game. And now with the DLC, that fight encapsulates the worst aspects of the game. It's like, oh man, look at what they've done to my boy. It's got that kind of energy.
Once the beautiful music and atmosphere wears off, the regal ancestor spirit is pretty bad. In fact, because it's a more atmospheric fight, it suffers very heavily from being recycled. Almost everything about this boss is identical to the regular ancestor spirit found in Siofra, so it leaves a much weaker impression this time around. I don't want to undersell just how good the visuals are, but we're only 6 bosses in, and I've lauded both Renala and Radon for the same thing. I would be more okay with these aesthetic-focused bosses if the traditional fights were up to par. I don't mean to suggest that every boss needs intensive mechanical complexity on the level of Godric or Radagon, because having some simpler bosses like this one can serve as a refreshing break from those, but it's harder to justify their inclusion when the rest of the bosses are suffering. Much like Renala, there's a lot of empty time where you're just running around to close distance. The thing can teleport across the arena, which just feels like the fight is being unnecessarily padded. Its actual attacks aren't bad in terms of variety and fairness, but it's very slow-paced in a way that causes lots of impatience. On top of that, the Regal Ancestor Spirit can heal a bunch of health with, as far as I can tell, no way to prevent it. It absorbs the souls of the rest of the animals in the arena, and the only way to counteract it is just piling on damage. I suppose that calling it a DPS check would be a reasonable justification, but that doesn't do anything to change the boring factor.
I'd agree with that. This is essentially a really, really boring version of the Four Kings, where you just have to DPS the crap out of him as fast as possible. Otherwise, you're going to be chasing him around the arena all the time while he's healing half his health pool, just over and over and over. It's very tedious.
The magic breath attacks are especially annoying since all you have to do is back off and wait for them to finish. It's not like it sticks out for being exceedingly terrible, but it doesn't do anything particularly well either. If the regular Ancestor Spirit didn't exist, I'd probably feel differently, but that fight comes first and does everything that this fight does. In fact, it's more memorable since that's the first time you get to experience the atmosphere. I won't rehash all of my complaints about the generous boss reuse in Elden Ring, but this definitely demonstrates why it can be a problem. The Ancestor Spirit isn't interesting to fight, and just getting to experience it once would have been plenty. Unfortunately, I don't really know what else to say about it. The boss is very basic and one of the more forgettable Remembrance bosses. They would do well to prolong the fight a lot less. Perhaps letting the player kill some of the animal spirits to stunt the healing would be a viable option. I'm not sure if there's a limit on how often it can heal, but it definitely needs one. I've had fights where I had to go through at least 3 full health bars to
This is a new move. I've never seen this boss do this, where it does the little roly-poly thing. I've actually never seen that move. Like, ever. Did they patch that out? I'm curious now. Let me know in the comments of the stream, like, if they patched this move out, because I've never seen the boss roll like this.
take it down, and its moveset isn't nearly interesting enough to warrant it taking that long. All in all, the fight doesn't really bring anything to the table, and I would have much rather seen a unique boss occupy Nokron rather than fighting this thing again. It gets a very disappointed thumbs down from me. Gank fights have always been extremely hit or miss throughout the series, and Elden Ring is no exception. The Valiant Gargoyles are a pretty big miss, and the only reason I didn't used to hate them as much as I do now was because I usually and unknowingly came to the fight over-leveled. They're available as soon as you have access to Nokron, but the deep-root depth that they guard always felt like a more late-game area to me, so I would hold off until further in the game. By that point, I usually had enough DPS to kill the first gargoyle before the second one even showed up, and the fight was nothing special. Now that I have experience fighting them at what seems like a more reasonable level, I really don't like them. The trap with gank fights that this boss falls into is that it pits you against 2 enemies whose movesets don't complement each other. These gargoyles
Amen.
and the Blackblade Kindreds that they're
Amen.
based on feel like they were designed with one-on-one fights in mind, since their melee attacks don't sync up well when fought in a pair. It's also incredibly annoying to keep your attention on 2 of them at once. When they both decide to attack, there's basically no chance for you to do anything other than watch and dodge. Compare this to something like Ornstein and Smo, who are built with each other in mind. They'll often take turns attacking so that you can juggle each of their movesets throughout the fight. These gargoyles are pretty solid enemies when placed on their own, but they don't add any value to each other. As a result, the only good part of the fight is the time before the second gargoyle shows up. Individually, they exhibit the traits of a well-balanced enemy with fair telegraphs and dodgeable moves and all of that. There's still a few unnecessarily delayed attacks, but some of them do look more natural on the gargoyles to make it a bit more excusable. The only move I'm not a huge fan of during the initial phase is the giant AoE that the first one can do, since it's kind of like Godric's Whirlwind. If you aren't a safe enough distance away when he starts it up, you're probably going to get hit. As soon as
This is one thing about their movesets, right? I don't think their movesets are inherently bad on their own, but I think the fact that you lock on to their like center of mass and several builds with smaller weapons have a significantly harder time actually hitting them because of that. Like that's a significant issue with this boss in particular, where you're locking onto them and attacking with like a dagger or something is very, and like a dagger or like a smaller sword is going to have issues just because of how mobile they are and how small their legs are by comparison to the weapon that you have, right? Like their hitboxes for their legs are much smaller than if you have like a ranged attack or if you have like a big sword or something. It's that thing where hitting them can be difficult depending on what weapons you're using. And there are significant like weapons there's a large enough weapons in the game where that can become a consistent problem depending on what your build is.
the Twin Blade one shows up, everything goes downhill. There's one single attack that these guys have that makes initiating on your own way too risky. At any point in the fight, they can start spitting out a poison mist, which covers a good portion of the ground and deals tick damage while applying poison buildup. This single move is all it takes for the fight's quality to plummet. The first problem with it is that it has a terrible audio cue and visual indicator for where the poison is. You need to keep both gargoyles on screen at all times because otherwise there's no way to know when it's coming out. The noise they make when doing it is ridiculously quiet, and the actual poison is difficult to make out, and you won't notice it hitting you until your health is already being chunked. For starters, it needs a much more obvious audio tell, and the poison needs to be way more distinct on the ground. This move can also cause you to take damage through no fault of your own. If you're in the middle of an engagement with one gargoyle and the other starts spitting poison out, it's very likely that the poison will reach you before you can run to safety, even if the second gargoyle is really far away.
Yes, the poison move, on top of just having two enemies that are not accounting for each other, that poison move is the thing that kills this fight for a lot of people. It's a massive AoE that already damages you and then applies poison on top of it. Also, like, it's not obvious where the hitbox of it ends. They can do it over and over and over, and they can do it while you're trying to heal while dealing with the other one's bullshit, right? It's that overclocking coming in again, just giving these enemies are clearly not built to work with each other. They're just meant to kill you on their own. So when you stack them together, you're just making a tedious encounter.
This is part of what I mean when I say these enemies aren't meant to be fought together. One's poison mist can completely interrupt your fight with the other, like they want to constantly reset your tempo and drag things out as long as possible. With all of this in mind, the best way to fight them is to turtle and wait until their attacks line up in a way that you can sneak in a single hit. Play very passively until the stars align and you can take down one. As soon as it's back to a 1v1, things are better, but that doesn't excuse the nonsense that goes on when both are alive. It's extremely tedious, and you have to be really careful about when you choose to engage, because the poison will absolutely rip through your health if you get caught in a bad spot. The second gargoyle alone is already too excessive, but throwing in one of the worst moves in the game on top of that makes the fight a complete train wreck. I'm not sure what the rationale was behind both of these decisions. It's not like adding in a second gargoyle makes the fight unique, it's just piling on more and more boss reuse, which the game already has too much of. The poison mist is so blatantly ridiculous that I'm guessing it's one of those things that they didn't have enough time to properly adjust and playtest. They're usually pretty good about telegraphs on ranged attacks like this, and I would like to have enough faith in FromSoft that they just didn't have the resources to fix this, rather than it being an intentional design decision. With this game though, who knows? I don't think there's any gank fight in Elden Ring composed of completely unique enemies. It feels like whenever there's a 2-on-1, it's with guys that aren't originally meant to be fought 2-on-1. If they didn't have time to make two completely unique assets to fight alongside each other, then that's understandable, but at that point you should be questioning whether gank fights are a good idea to have in the first place. Tossing in the same enemy twice just screams unoriginality, and you wouldn't be wrong to argue that the game's scope proved too much for them to handle. It's not a good fight, lots of it is unnecessary, and it's yet another one that I've grown to hate the more I've played.
That's a very fitting end to fighting the gargoyles getting killed by the stupid poison buildup.
Estelle is pretty weird, both in terms of quality and of his context in the world. As the finale to Ronnie's quest, I think he's very fitting. His design doesn't really seem like it belongs in Elden Ring, but that ends up working in his favor. It often feels like there's larger things at play when going through Ronnie's quest, and putting such a peculiar-looking fight at the end lends very well to that mysterious feeling. The sequence of events you go through to reach Estelle is also worthy of a finisher like this, so in terms of looks and theme, it'd be one of the strongest in the game. At least that's what I would say if Estelle weren't casually recycled near the end in the consecrated snowfield.
Oh man, I agree with that point so much. It's such a unique boss, but then copy and pasting it somewhere else is such a letdown. It's like you had something unique. You're just making it less special. Please stop making things less special from. Please, please stop.
It really tarnished his unique image, and the Stars of Darkness version is so much more anticlimactic. He was such a special entity to fill in a special quest, but the fact that he can live in any old cave makes his presence a lot less impressive. I digress though, that doesn't speak much to the mechanics of the fight, so let's talk about that. Estelle reminds me a bit of the amygdala from Bloodborne, in that you have to stick under his body and between his limbs to avoid lots of attacks. It's a bit of an unconventional method that's made possible thanks to the lanky construction of his body, and it does lead to some more interesting responses to his attacks. It can be trickier to damage him this way since his hurt boxes are pretty narrow, but I never found it frustrating or unfair. Elden Ring is actually pretty good about having accurate hitboxes and hurt boxes across the board, even with a twiggy body like Estelle's. It's
I like how he's using the term "hurt boxes." I think that's a funny term.
easier to focus on his head whenever possible anyway. The one exception to this is his grab hitbox. Now, I don't have any personal experience with this, so I can't show any examples, but I've seen many clips floating around of his grab being able to catch you when you aren't near where the actual hands meet. It always looked like that it extends too far up his arms. I'm not sure if this has been fixed in patches or not, but if it hasn't, I'd consider it a more notable flaw with him. These games have always struggled with grabs like this, so I guess it's not that outlandish to see it happen in Elden Ring. That aside, the main disadvantage that larger entities usually have is that you can't see what they're doing when you're so up close, and that does happen with Estelle too, but I'm honestly not sure how much that should be held against him. FromSoft has demonstrated before that they can make massive enemies work nicely with the camera, and it's always a luxury to see that happen, but the fact that they don't implement these solutions regularly means that there must be some rationale behind making you fight oversized enemies like this. One potential draw that I can think of is that it makes you rely on sound cues, which is a completely different skill than reading the boss visually. If the move is happening off screen but has a unique sound effect, you can ideally identify it that way and do your dodge timing accordingly. Estelle doesn't fully realize this potential since many sound effects on his attacks are the same, but it can still be helpful against some moves. For example, whenever he teleports, he can either move to another part of the arena or he can appear on top of you and go for a grab. It's not always easy to spot where he's coming from before he appears, but if he's going for the grab, then the teleporting sound effect for when he reappears is less delayed. If you catch on to that quickly enough, you know to look above you instead of panning around the arena so that you can dodge the incoming grab. Mix-ups like that are a bit underutilized, not only in Elden Ring but across the whole series, so it's always an interesting way to create varied defensive options and depart from the usual roll out of the way method. It's also hard to deny that large entities like this one would lose a lot of their visual appeal if they were shrunk down to fit into frame, and by this point, it's pretty clear that FromSoft wants to preserve that aspect with these bosses, even if it doesn't always play nice with the camera. There are just two moves with Estelle that I don't really like. The first is the aforementioned teleport that makes you run to the other side of the arena. It's similar to the issue with the Regal Ancestor spirits in that it creates a lot of empty time, though at least Estelle does have some ranged magic that you have to dodge while closing the distance. I'm still not a fan of moves like these since the game isn't really suited for running long distances without Torrent. The other is when he summons a bunch of meteors that rain from the sky for a few seconds. With things like this, I've never felt that there's any patterns or timings you can learn. The best way to stay safe is to roll or run away from them and just hope that you don't get hit. It's in the same courtyard as Rykard's skull raining attack or even Elden Beast's Elden Stars. Among these moves, Estelle's is probably the least annoying, but it still doesn't elicit a very interesting response. Overall, I'm not sure what to make of Estelle. It's a lot fairer with less of the bloated design that weighs down other bosses, but it's also the most ruined by being recycled later in the game, and it's so hard to just ignore that. I think it would be fair to say that Estelle, along with the Regal Ancestor, are great examples of why reuse can really hurt the image of a fight and why it's excessive in Elden Ring. At least they got more right with his movesets, because on that front, he's pretty good.
Yeah, I'd agree on that. And that's the one point on sort of repeating bosses, right? Is that when you repeat bosses that are incredibly unique, they become much less unique and the gimmick becomes annoying because you have to deal with it a second time, right? Like if we repeated any of the more gimmicky fights in Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 3, then that would become annoying on the second time because it's like I've already dealt with this gimmick, right? Like imagine if we had to fight two Wolnirs in the game, like two separate Wolnir bosses where we just run to a point, slap the bracelet until it breaks, and then we have to do it again. It's like that's just tedious. You're giving me the same tedious gimmick as before. You know, imagine if we had to fight two Rikards. Imagine how tedious that would be. You know, it's that thing where, you know, when a boss is really unique, whether in a good way or a bad way, duplicating it only makes it worse. Right? Whether the gimmick is good or bad, right? You're just fighting the same thing again. You know, it's not you're not adding to the world by just duplicating assets everywhere.
At first glance, there's a lot to like about Lich Dragon Fortisax. It's a nice break from the overabundance of field dragons found throughout the world, and the secrecy of his fight gives it a little bit more prestige. He's somewhat similar to Estelle in that he lies at the end of an optional quest line, though I feel like Fia's quest is easier to miss than Ronnie's. I did my first playthrough completely blind, and Fortisax is one of 3 bosses on this list that I missed completely, the other 2 being the Gargoyles and Dragon Lord Placidusax. I'm curious to know how many people missed major bosses like this one, actually. Given how expansive Elden Ring is, I imagine it's fairly common to have missed at least one boss by playing blind, but it also probably depends on how thorough of a player you are. I would be interested to hear your experiences with this.
Yeah, I think in terms of like major bosses for this game, I would probably say that this game probably has the highest number of bosses that you can miss out of any of the other From Software stuff. Um, just because a lot of these things are locked behind things that you don't quite understand, right? Like Ronnie's quest line, you know, in general, right, leads to several bosses, right, that you deal with and several unique encounters that you can deal with, but it's locked behind a quest line, right? Like dealing with her quest line locks Estelle, locks the dragon behind Estelle. I forget the name of it. Locks Taish behind it. You know, it's just there are those 3 bosses, right? And it's one of those things where, you know, Fia's quest line, you have to deal with the spam of her encounter in an underground area. So you're already not quite sure how to get there or how to do that on a first run. And then you deal with all of her questline stuff, which requires, you know, a significant overlap with stuff in Raya Lucaria and stuff dealing with getting to the Divine Tower of Liurnia, right? And then that leads you to Fortisax, right? And Fortisax is basically just a beefed up sort of Uber dragon, right? Which sounds good, but in practice, he's basically just a regular sort of Farum Azula dragon with a couple of extra things added. And I think that makes the fight kind of underwhelming. And maybe he'll mention it.
Anyway, I want to like Fortisax more than I do, but there's a couple pretty big issues holding it back. First off, the overwhelming visuals that accompany Fortisax's fight are both a blessing and a curse. They serve the aesthetic much more than they serve the mechanics, because if there's one fatal flaw to Fortisax, it's that it's too visually busy. The special effects flashing everywhere, like the red lightning or occasional deathblight pools, can be highly distracting and make it hard to tell what you're actually being hit with. While the lightning has very good contrast, everything else, including the boss itself, blends in too much with the arena's dark color palette, which doesn't always make for a great experience. When it's difficult to make out everything in the arena like this, some amount of time has to be spent discerning what's actually happening before evaluating your response to it, and while such an approach can work, it's omnipresent in Fortisax's fight, which I'm not a huge fan of. I think it's just too excessive, and there are plenty of bosses that prove you can make fights visually interesting without having to distract the player as much. Fortisax still has some fantastic animations with his attacks, particularly the signature lightning lance spins, so even if the special effects were toned down, the boss's spectacle could still remain intact. The main culprit to me is all of the
Yeah, that's the one thing about fighting this boss and several others. It's just that there's too much shit going on the screen that you're having a hard time focusing on the actual fight. You know, that's one thing that I feel like this game suffers from immensely. Is just spectacle gets in the way of mechanics, right? And that's part of the issue with several of these bosses. One thing I also don't like that this boss does is that one sort of tracking lightning move. I really hate the tracking moves that track you sort of obsessively until right before the attack hits, right? Like I really don't like those particular attacks, right? You see that with his attack. You see that with the lightning attack with the Uber Tree Sentinel, the Draconic Tree Sentinels. You know, it's one of those attacks that it's all timing. You know, there's no real counter to it besides just dodge at the right time, as far as I can tell. You know, it's just one of those attacks that just like, okay, it's time to damage player, damage is incoming, hit button at right time. You know, it's just it's boring to deal with because there's no real telegraph besides I'm about to shoot you. Get ready to dodge a bullet. Man, you know, like it. You know, it's just and it tracks you no matter where you are. Like there's a very limited amount of moves that do like a tracking move that I think are fair, right? I actually think Placidusax is tracking sort of AOE things. The big lightning sort of like they're not bubbles, but big lightning AOEs. They do track you, but there is enough of a wind up where you can easily get out of them, right? And you can and they spawn on you and have a charge up time, right? It's not like this where it's not like Fortisax where it follows you for a good bit and then strikes right before the tracking stops or right after the tracking stops, right? Placidusax only tracks for where you initially are when the attack begins. As soon as that's over with, it just charges up and explodes, right? But the tracking stops as soon as it begins, right? And that's something I think helps with those moves as opposed to these moves where you just are tracking basically right up until the move is about to explode, right? It's similar to the one of the bubble abilities by the diaper dudes and Blanedell, right? Where the orb of energy just appears on you and then just almost activates right on top of you all the time. It's just that it's a really annoying way to arbitrarily have difficulty come from a move that cannot be dodged until right when the attack is about to go through. You know, it's one of those attack patterns that I really dislike in this game.
the red lightning flickering over his body. When you're up close trying to do melee attacks, it can make it a bit harder identifying where his actual hitboxes are coming out during his attacks. There's also a quirk with Fortisax that acts as something of a melee deterrent. External lightning will target you and strike periodically for as long as you're underneath his body. It's kind of like a timer that's constantly ticking, and every time it reaches 0, you have to be ready to dodge. This is a pretty interesting idea in principle, but it's difficult to tune properly since ideally you want the lightning to land only at moments where the player isn't in the middle of dodging a regular move from the boss. Since every move has different timing though, there's no guarantee that this will happen. It's another case of potentially locking you into a risky situation even though you didn't make any direct mistakes yourself. The best way I found to circumvent it is to just stay on the move, which to be fair might be the intention. The tracking stops briefly before the strike actually hits, and I'm pretty sure that that delay is long enough for you to just walk out of the way. This is definitely better than forcing you to roll, but then the problem that crops up is that it can prevent you from attacking at otherwise opportune times. As soon as Fortisax is done attacking, you need to check that lightning timer to make sure that it's safe to lock yourself in an attack animation. If the timing doesn't match up, there's not much you can do about it. As you may have noticed, punishing aggression in some capacity is a very regular thing across bosses, and it's one of the more general trends that I really dislike. I talked about this a little bit with Margit, but Fortisax is a good example to elaborate with. Finding ways to initiate yourself is a great means of skill expression that the series has always utilized well, but many boss behavior in Elden Ring completely abandons that possibility. No matter how good you get at the fight, Margit will still pull his knife out when you try punishing some attacks. The gargoyles will always spit poison that you have to run away from. Fortisax's lightning always has a chance to disrupt your attack opportunities. These are roadblocks that you just have to accept as limitations on what you can do against the boss, rather than obstacles that can be countered with some improvements to your play. Not only does it reduce motivation to get better at Elden Ring, it also actively reduces your engagement with the boss. One would probably expect Elden Ring to have the most replayability out of all the Souls games, but things like this would suggest the opposite. Fighting bosses feels the same every time, because there's not much you can do to give yourself an advantage. Because of his lightning tracking, Fortisax is one of few bosses who I found more fun when using magic instead of melee. Different bosses being made easier with different builds is a strength of the game as far as I see it, but it goes overboard when one build feels blatantly discouraged over another. It leaves me feeling very lukewarm to Fortisax overall. I would take him over the field dragons any day, but he still has some things to improve on.
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with pretty much all of what he said about that boss. There's just a lot of significant problems with just delaying shit and trying to catch the player out during the delay of that shit. And that's the problem that it's a problem from a perspective of tedium where you're just arbitrarily extending the fight. It creates less openings, which means it takes you longer to do anything, right? And oftentimes they'll end up comboing you with a mixture of the thing that's making the tedium annoying and an actual move that would normally be okay. But when you mix the tedious move of the tracking lightning along with the actual regular attacks, you're just stacking stuff on top of each other that creates a clusterfuck, right? And a lot of fights like this that have a bajillion things going on at the same time, whether it be all the move sets, all the visual shit just appearing on top of like a tracking move that is there to sort of just delay you from doing things just because, right? It's not even like an actual move the boss does. It's just a thing that happens when dealing with the boss, It's just one of those things that I think arbitrarily extends fights for no other reason, you know? It's just a way to pad the time in between what the player can do, and I think that's part of the problem. But I thought about trying to get through half of this maybe today, but after thinking about it and with StreamYards being weird, halfway point would be roughly about like here-ish. That'd be what, like another like 15 minutes. So I'm going to stop here. We're going to break this up into 3 parts probably, and we'll end the year with the last third of this video. So I don't know where we're going to stop next time, but we'll see how it goes. But either way, I'd just like to thank you all for watching this stream. And if you have any recommendations for other videos to react to outside of Elden Ring stuff, because again, I'm done reacting to Elden Ring stuff, leave a comment. I also have a Discord. It is linked in the description. I think it works. Sometimes it hasn't worked, but it should work. There's a place where you can post recommendations for ESAS reactions. So yeah, just thank you once again for tuning in if you did, or thank you for watching the re-upload. And I hope you all have a good Saturday, and God bless.